Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the docking procedure. Chris Hadfield is one of the best known astronauts of all time, and he had quite a harrowing story on his first space flight. During this flight, he and his fellow astronauts had the pleasure of somehow navigating a £250,000 shuttle towards a target on the Mir space station that was about the size of a coffee cup. Yeah, the most tense few minutes of their lives, I can imagine. Chris's job was to watch and communicate the speed and range information to the pilot, which is a super important job, obviously, because it's such a precise thing. There's a time window, they have to be traveling at just the right speed, and they need to be accurate. Chris explained, quote, "If you hit Mir just a little too soft, then the spring mechanisms would bounce you off." He went on to say, quote, "If you hit Mir just a little too hard, then you would break Mir in half and kill the 3 people on board. So you've got to hit it exactly right." Yeah, definitely high stakes at this point. So when the crew is about 30 feet away, their 2 sensors start telling them completely different things. One said 32 feet and the other said 20 feet. Chris said, quote, "They're either both wrong or one of them is completely wrong. Now, what do? There's nobody to ask. If the crew on board the flight deck of the shuttle don't solve this problem in the next 30 seconds, then the whole flight is bust and done." Instead of panicking, however, Chris explained that he just went, quote, "back to basics." This insanely intelligent person knew the dimensions of the docking module, so he used his thumb to help him sort of eyeball the distance through a window. I mean, that alone is just wild. Apparently this helped him to figure out that they were 21 feet away, not 32. He used his stopwatch to figure out the math of how fast they were going and when the thrusters should be fired, and thankfully, he was spot on. Chris finished the story by saying, quote, "It wasn't for a few minutes before one of us looked around and said, 'Hey, we did it, we're actually here.' That was a big relief of emotion on board." Yeah, I can imagine. In our number 9 spot today, we have the gas leak. In July of 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project took place, which was a historic moment for both space travel as well as just for politics. This was the first joint spaceflight between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it marked the end of the space race. And while it started off extremely smoothly and was going well, this flight soon became known for an entirely different reason. On return, the 2 spacecrafts, the American one holding 3 astronauts and the Soviet one holding 2 cosmonauts, met in orbit around the Earth and docked to each other. Here the group began exchanging information, they were speaking each other's language to make communication easier, and also just as a sign of respect. Things were going amazingly considering the recent history. After 44 hours together they parted, and after a few more days they were on their descents back to Earth. During re-entry, however, a malfunction with the reaction control system, which is the system that controls the altitude, this malfunction ended up causing highly poisonous nitrogen tetroxide to enter the cabin where the American astronauts were. Thankfully, once this spacecraft landed, the cabin becomes ventilated, which gave them time to be rescued without being fatally injured. The astronauts on board were rushed to the hospital and were found to have developed a form of pneumonia that is caused from chemicals, but within weeks they all recovered and lived to tell the tale of this historic space flight. In our number 8 spot today, we have Mir EO-23. This is the name of a mission that was part of the Shuttle Mir space program, which was a, quote, collaborative 11-mission space program between Russia and the United States that involved American space shuttles visiting the Russian space station Mir, Russian cosmonauts flying on the shuttle, and an American astronaut flying aboard a Soyuz spacecraft to engage in long-duration expeditions aboard Mir. During this mission, on February 23, 1997, a backup solid fuel oxygen canister ended up catching fire. This fire was in one module, but it quickly began to spew molten metal, and the crew on board was concerned that it could melt through the hull of the space station. Smoke began to fill the station, and the crew were forced to use respirators to continue breathing, but of course when it rains it pours, and some of the respirators were faulty and didn't supply oxygen. After burning for 14 minutes and the crew using up 3 fire extinguishers, the fire was thankfully put out. The smoke, however, remained thick for another 45 minutes. This was probably one of the most terrifying things that the crew went through, but this certainly was not the end of the road of struggles for these guys. Let me know down below in the comments if you want a part 2 of this video, and maybe we can cover the rest of what went wrong on this mission. In our number 7 spot today, we have Apollo 13. Definitely one of the most well-known space missions ever. Apollo 13 is famous for all of the most terrifying reasons. This mission was the 7th crewed mission in the Apollo space program, and it was the 3rd that was meant to land on the moon. The spacecraft launched on April 11, 1970, but the mission to land on the moon was quickly aborted 2 days into the flight after an oxygen tank in the service module failed. A quote, routine stir of an oxygen tank ignited damaged wire insulation inside it, causing an explosion that vented the contents of both the service module's oxygen tanks to space. Without this oxygen that's needed for breathing and for generating electric power, the service module's propulsion as well as their life support systems were just unable to operate. This meant that the command module systems had to be shut down in order to conserve the resources it had left for re-entry. This meant that the crew had to transfer to the Lunar module as a sort of lifeboat. The Lunar module was only designed to support 2 men on the moon's surface for 2 days, so Mission Control had to create new procedures so that it could support 3 men for 4 days. The crew was in for some of the most difficult times while the ground crew worked to help bring them home alive. Safe to say everyone was as stressed out as they could possibly be. Thankfully, the crew on board the ship were returned to Earth safely, and this story, although horrifying, did wonders to restore public interest in the Apollo program. This story is one of the most famous space stories ever, thanks to the several dramatizations made about it. In our number 6 spot today, we have the STS-27 disaster. During the launch of STS-27, which took place in 1988, debris from the right solid rocket booster struck the underside of the craft, which ended up severely damaging over 700 tiles on the outside of the craft, as well as taking off one tile completely. It might not seem like a lot, but every little thing matters when you're doing something like going to space. So it's important to note that this mission was classified because of the fact that there was a surveillance satellite being launched along with it. Because of this, things had to be done a little differently, so when the crew on board sent photos of the damage back to the ground, the photos were encrypted and they were extremely low quality. Mission Control deemed the damage to be just light and shadows and told the crew to continue, much to their dismay. Once landed, it became clear that Atlantis was the single most damaged shuttle that was thankfully able to successfully land. The survival of the crew came down to basically happenstance, which is just terrifying. This was only the second mission after the disaster of the Challenger, so should this one have gone fatal, we likely wouldn't have seen the continuation of the program. In our number 5 spot today, we have the organic object. Leland Melvin is an American engineer and retired NASA astronaut who served on board the space shuttle Atlantis as a mission specialist. He is an incredibly brilliant man with an incredible resume, and that is exactly why this story is so unnerving. He claimed that while on a space mission as he was orbiting Earth, which for the record, how cool would it be able to tell a story like that? You're just orbiting Earth. While he was on this mission, he saw a quote alien-like organic object. NASA disputed his claims and said that what he saw was just ice, but I feel like I trust the person who actually saw it with their own eyes. Leland went on to write that whatever he saw was quote translucent, curved, organic looking. I have no explanations to offer, but I will say it certainly is interesting and a little bit terrifying. In our number 4 spot today, we have the space snake. Dr. Franklin Story Musgrave is an American physician and retired NASA astronaut, and considering how credible he tends to be, despite the absurdities of this story, it makes it hard to pass off as a lie so easily. While he was in space, he claims that he saw something that I don't wish upon anyone, a sort of space snake. He said that he saw an 8-foot-long white snake floating through space. I don't even know what I would do. Probably cry, call Houston, I'm not sure. There are many people who think that this was simply just a detached hose from the spaceship, but Dr. Musgrave remains adamant on what he saw, and to be completely honest, I kinda believe him. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. I mean, I don't know what happens in space, but I find it hard to believe that this person, who would likely be familiar with the parts of a spacecraft, mistook a hose for a snake. In our number 3 spot today, we have the lights. Leroy Chiao was the commander of the ISS in 2005, and this is exactly when this strange sighting occurred. It is said that he wasn't the only one who witnessed this though, as it is said that the entire crew was there to see this unexplainable occurrence along with him. Basically, they saw a strange set of lights while up in space. He went on to describe the lights and said that they were in the formation of an upside down V, and that they ended up stumbling upon this bizarre situation after the formation flew past them. I'm just gonna say it, we're all thinking it. It sounds a lot like aliens. I just don't have any other possible explanations, and you're telling me that the whole crew saw it? I swear, nothing will convince me more of aliens than an astronaut's first-hand account. In our number 2 spot today, we have glowing green. Gordon Cooper is a well-known astronaut after having flown the Mercury 9 and the Gemini 5, and in fact, he was the last American to spend time in space alone. But despite all these exciting accolades, I want to take you to May 15th, 1963. Here, he was sent off to space in a Mercury capsule for a 22-orbit journey around the Earth, and while on this journey, he saw something very unsettling, a glowing green object that would approach his capsule. During his final orbit, he did tell the tracking station of this object that was quickly approaching his capsule, and they were able to pick up this UFO on their radar, but once Cooper landed, reporters were told that he was not allowed to answer questions regarding this UFO. It's even more interesting considering how Gordon has been a vocal and firm believer in UFOs, so I ask, what do you guys think it was? In our number 1 spot today, we have space music. After 4 days of space travel in 1969, the Apollo 10 astronauts, Tom Stafford, Gene Cernan, and John Young, were on the far side of the moon. We were full of curiosity over what the other side could possibly be containing, but it wasn't necessarily the discovery people were expecting. While the astronauts were taking photographs and experiencing this new to humans area, they began to hear some otherworldly music coming from their headsets, and this continued for 1 full hour. Gene is said to have exclaimed, "Boy, that sure is weird music, we're gonna have to find out about that," while John replied, "Nobody will believe us." For decades, this space music was left a complete mystery until just recently when an explanation was put forward. It is being claimed that perhaps this sound emanated from radio interference between spacecrafts. While this is a fairly reasonable explanation, not everyone is exactly convinced.
Starting us off at number 10 is the knocking. On a voyage to space back in 2008, Yang Liwei became the first Chinese astronaut to venture into space aboard the Shenzhou 5. On the night of October 16th, Yang had a very peculiar sound coming from outside. It sounded like someone was knocking. The sound sounded like an iron bucket being hit with a wooden hammer. The scariest part of it all was that the sound wasn't coming from the inside of the spaceship, and it wasn't coming from the outside, which makes no sense because space is a vacuum and you can't hear anything, noise literally doesn't exist. Sound waves need a medium like water or air to pass through, so how did that even happen? Riddle me that, yeah? What makes this whole thing even weirder is that astronauts aboard the following Shenzhou 5 and 6 missions heard the same knocking. So was it a mechanism on the Shenzhou spaceships that caused this knocking to be heard? I don't know. I ain't a damn astronaut. Coming in at number 9 are space snakes. So this one comes from Dr. Story Musgrave, a man who has 6 academic degrees, was part of the Marine Corps, is a physician and mathematician, and he's a bloody NASA astronaut as well. Oh, and he shares the record of most space flights ever taken. So I mean, this man has literally lived 9 lives in one. Like, save some jobs for the rest of us, I swear to God. I'm just trying to get by at this point. Either way, a story said on 2 of his missions he saw something out there that he doesn't have an answer to. He saw a snake sort of thing. It was 6 to 8 feet long, it was rubbery, and it had internal waves inside of it. And it sort of just followed him for an extended period of time. He claims that being in space makes you see things you'd never imagine. Well, no shit. And that he believes that there are creatures out there much more developed than any of us. And I mean, they've been out there for 100 million years. I'd hope as hell they're advanced. More advanced than us. But honestly, my theory on the snake is that they're just alien devices that just roam space and detect spacecrafts in the area and sort of tail them and send that information back to the alien HQ that deployed it. Back to planet Blark. At number 8, we have decompression. So anytime a vessel goes on a voyage to outer space, the changes in atmospheric pressure the astronauts experience can be highly dangerous unless they're doing all the procedures correctly. The year was 1965, Soyuz 11 was re-entering Earth's orbit, and 3 crew members on board ended up dying when depressurized. A technician on the vessel back in Houston said while they were in the vacuum chamber, he accidentally depressurized his own spacesuit and then lost consciousness. He said the last feeling or sensation that he remembered was the moisture on his tongue beginning to boil. Rapid decompression is so serious the symptoms can include vaporizing blood, swollen flesh, exploding eyeballs, and ruptured lungs. Can you imagine how screwed up the situation is when the moisture on your tongue is boiling? Say less. Also, do you guys like my nail color? I love it. Filling on number 7 slot is the green sighting. So Gordon Cooper is an astronaut that's flown the Gemini 5 and the Mercury 9. He was also the last American to ever spend time in space alone. In May of 1963, he was doing a circumnavigational trip around the Earth on the Mercury capsule, and when he was passing Perth, he saw something. A massive green glowing object came straight for him at a speed he'd never seen before. It was real, it wasn't just illusion, and the Machi tracking station in Western Australia even picked it up on their radar, so it was very much real. Cooper reported it to NBC, but when he landed was told they couldn't question him about it. So that's just another thing that they won't tell us. I feel like we should honestly start rioting until governments all over the world stop keeping from us. I'm over it. I've had enough. Now, at number 6 is the alien music, which unfortunately cannot be found on Spotify or Apple Music, so you guys just don't even bother trying to find it. Just don't. Now, back in 1969, 4 days after we stepped foot on the moon for the first time, astronauts John Young, Tom Stafford, and Gene Cernan were on the far dark side of the moon. And as Mufasa said to Simba, we don't go there. Now, the 3 men were just chilling on the moon, taking pictures of the craters and drinking some grape juice, when they started hearing a strange, otherworldly sort of noise inside their headsets. Now, the music continued for a good hour, and none of the men had heard these types of sound before, and knew no one would believe them if they told. They tried to find out where or what the music was, but they simply couldn't. Decades later, the mystery was just never solved, but some claim it was just sound coming from radio interference between spacecrafts, which I get, but how would 3 seasoned astronauts not know what that sounded like? Surely they would have heard that a billion times before as well. Why the hell you lying? Why the hell you lying? I made it PG. Coming in at number 5 is the Millennium Falcon, not to be confused with the one in Star Wars. While watching the ISS NASA live feed back in 2016, Jaden Beeson said he saw a metal spaceship. He said the UFO that he saw seemed similar to the Millennium Falcon found in Star Wars, so he realized he definitely needed to take a screenshot to prove what he was seeing. The metal craft had a blue glow to it and stayed hovering above Earth for about 2 minutes. And it's very clear to see it's not even a small craft by any means, you can definitely see it. Either way, Jaden sent the image to NASA, but he's never gotten an explanation or a response back, which makes the whole thing even that much more suspicious. Are all these craft just hovering above Earth and they're just going away? Why? Come in, you guys. We're friends. At number 4 is the cigar. A bit of background so you know how credible this really is. Musa Manarov was a Soviet-Azerbaijani astronaut who holds a record for the longest continuous time spent in space. That record, 541 days. So he's had a lot of experience being in the Black Abyss and seeing everything. One day in 1991, he was on his way to the Mir space station when something caught his eye. On camera, he caught 2 minutes worth of footage of what appears to be a cigar-shaped UFO. It's just floating, lighting up at certain points, spiraling in every direction, and just actually there. But many say that it's hard to tell whether something is close or far away from you in space since you literally have no frame of reference. So you also can't tell how big or small it is. So this cigar could be bigger than Earth, or it could be smaller than me. We don't even know. Musa vehemently denied it being space junk because he's seen space junk many times and this ain't it. And considering he holds the record, I say we trust the man. He sounds credible. Filling on number 3 slot is Major Vladimir. Now, Major General Vladimir Kovalyanok was a cosmonaut in the 80s who saw something bizarre during the Salja mission. They were moving over South Africa when he saw an oval-shaped object. Now, initially it flew straight, but then an explosion of golden light occurred. A few seconds later, the oval object transformed into 2 golden spheres. After that, Vladimir just saw white smoke and the spheres just disappeared into thin air. He said he tried to take a picture of it, but it exploded before he had the chance. When he reported to Mission Control, it was all over Soviet headlines, magazines, newspapers, and most people excluded any option of it being extraterrestrial, but it did happen. It has no explanation whatsoever, and it was seen by not 1 but 2 people, Vladimir and his partner Viktor Savinykh. I hope I said that right. Savinykh. Now at number 2 are the other craft. So we all know about Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon and the whole leap for mankind spiel, but that was not the full story. According to Maurice Chatelain, the retired chief of NASA communications system, Armstrong saw things when he got off the spacecraft. Seconds before he stepped down the ladder, he saw 2 massive UFOs hovering above him, and Edwin Aldrin even took pictures of them. That was followed by 2 minutes of radio silence because one of the television cameras overheated and then lost reception. How very convenient. During those 2 minutes, there was a critical lost transmission, and that was Armstrong saying, "These babies were huge, sir, enormous. Oh God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out here, lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us." And that was never made public. It was never even included in any of the records, and he refused to talk about it until his death. Thankfully enough, people had corroborated the evidence that we do know to be true, and I love how this massive part of history that has this whole other side to it we just didn't get told. I'm angry, I'm annoyed, but I wish Neil had told us because this is just shocking behavior on his part. Shocking. And finally, at number 1 is the check mark. Back in 2005, American astronaut Lunar had been the commander of the International Space Station for about 6 months at that point. One day he was installing some antennas 230 miles above Earth when something caught his eye. He saw the sequence of strange lights that seemed to be in a line that looked like an upside down check mark. Not Nike, it's not just do it. It's definitely not. But the formation flew by him and he was just flabbergasted at what the hell he had just seen. Skeptics tried to convince Leo that what he had seen was just lights of boats reflecting upwards, but a reflection of lights is one thing. You know when something has its own life and it's moving past you. Reflections only move if the thing that's being reflected is moving, which they weren't. Riddle me that.
Starting off number 10 now, we have the knocking. In 2003, Yang Liwei became the first Chinese person in space. It was a historic occasion, but it also became famous for a creepy occurrence. In 2016, Yang told an interviewer that he heard someone knocking on the outside of the spaceship on that trip. He was terrified and tried to peek out of the porthole but couldn't see anything outside. When he got back to Earth, Yang described the sound to experts. He even tried to recreate it for them, but nobody could identify it. In the years since, many people have tried to explain this strange phenomenon. Some say it could have been some space debris, but others say that this is unlikely, as space debris is few and far between. Others claim it could be the expanding and contracting of the ship due to the changing temperature of the spaceship as it orbited the Earth. Even though that's the leading theory, many people have their own theories about aliens or time travelers being responsible for the mysterious knocking sound. Moving on to number 9 now, we have alien music. In 1969, American astronauts Tom Stafford, Gene Cernan, and John Young went to the far side of the moon for the Apollo 10 mission. It was going to be the final test before Apollo 11 took 3 humans to walk on the surface of the moon for the first time. When the Apollo 10 astronauts were orbiting around the far side of the moon, they took photographs of its surface. As they were working away, they began to hear music. Specifically, they heard a strange whistling sound that lasted nearly an hour. When it faded away, Commander Cernan said, "Boy, that sure is weird music. We're going to have to find out about that." Pilot Young replied, "Nobody would believe us." And for the most part, they were right. Many people couldn't explain the sound that they claimed to have heard, and so they just didn't believe it. The leading theory is that the sound came from radio interference between spacecrafts. Some people have dismissed that though, and have insisted that the astronauts would have known the difference between radio interference and their spacey music. Coming in at number 8 now, we have snakes in space. In 1994, Dr. Story Musgrave did an interview where he described his career as an astronaut, and one particular time which shook him to that day. He said, "On 2 of my missions, I still don't have an answer. I have seen a snake out there, 6, 7, 8 feet long. It is rubbery because it has internal waves in it, and it follows you for a rather long period of time. The more you fly in space, the more you see an incredible amount of things out there, and that sort of thing brings to you really a certainty that other living creatures are out there." Now usually an account like this might be dismissed, but Musgrave is a doctor, he has 6 academic degrees, is a trained mathematician, he was in the Marine Corps and was a NASA astronaut. He seems like a credible witness. He believes that there are advanced creatures existing in space itself, and that he has even tried to communicate with them in the hopes that they come down and get him. Whatever that means. Next up at number 7 now, we have docking. In 1995, famous Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield had his first space flight. His job was to relay the speed and range information to the pilot as they were docking into the Russian Mir space station. Any mistakes could have resulted in a total disaster. Too soft and they would have just bounced off. Too hard and they would have broken the space station in half, killing the 3 people on board. Everything was going smoothly, but then one of the sensors started telling telling them they were 32 feet away, the other said 20 feet away, which was correct. If they didn't solve the problem in 30 seconds, it was over for them. Hadfield had to calculate how far they were away in his head, timing it with his stopwatch to decide when they should fire their thrusters. Luckily, they ended up being spot on and they docked almost perfectly. It took a few minutes before the astronauts began to realize they had done it. They were alive, they had avoided a space disaster, and they had lived to tell the tale. Moving on now to number 6, we have impossible. On May 5th, 1981, Russian cosmonaut Vladimir Kovalyonok looked out of his portal of the Salyut orbital space station. He then saw something which seemed inexplicable to him. When he returned to Earth, he told the world at a conference what he had seen. He said, "Many cosmonauts have seen phenomena which are far beyond the experiences of Earthmen. For 10 years, I have never spoken on such things. The encounter you asked me about happened on May 5th, 1981 at about 6 p.m. during the Salyut mission. At that time, we were over the area of South Africa, moving towards the area of the Indian Ocean. I just made some gymnastic exercises when I saw in front of me, through a porthole, an object which I could not explain. I saw this object, and then something happened that I could not explain, something impossible according to the laws of physics. The object had this shape, elliptical, and it flew with us. From a frontal view, it looked like it would rotate in flight direction. It only flew straight, but then a kind of explosion happened, very beautiful to watch, of golden light. That was the first part. Then, 1 or 2 seconds later, a second explosion followed somewhere else, and 2 spheres appeared, golden and very beautiful. After this explosion, I just saw white smoke, then a cloud-like sphere. Before we entered the darkness, we flew through the Terminator, the twilight zone between day and night. We flew eastwards, and when we entered the darkness of the Earth's shadow, I could see them no longer. The 2 spheres never returned." That was the end of the quote. There have rarely been descriptions so vivid and detailed, and many people who hear Kovalyonok's story hold it up as proof of extraterrestrial life. Moving on now to number 5, we have toxic. In the mid-90s, Bob Kerbean took part on his first spacewalk as an astronaut. Unfortunately, disaster struck when a connector to a hose began to leak on the outside, spraying toxic ammonia all over him. He couldn't get back inside the space station covered in that stuff. He managed to stay calm and he fixed the leak, but he was still contaminated. He came up with a plan. Ammonia has a low boiling point, and so Bob decided to literally bake himself in the sunlight of space for an extra 30 minutes in order to vaporize the ammonia off him. He had to just sit out there in space, hoping that he got all the ammonia off and that he didn't poison the crew and himself when he got back into the station. It was a success. His plan worked, but it was one of the most surreal and scary moments an astronaut could ever experience. Next up at number 4 now, we have the lights. In 2005, astronaut Leroy Chiao was commander on the International Space Station for over 6 months. He was once doing a spacewalk to repair some antennas when something caught his eye. He saw some lights that seemed to be in a line, almost like an upside down check mark. They flew right past him, but his fellow astronaut didn't see because they were facing the other way. When he described the sighting to those back on the ground, they dismissed it as a fishing boat hundreds of miles below him. Chiao himself had stated that he doesn't believe there's ever been any tangible evidence that someone else is visiting Earth or has done so in the past. He has simply told his story as it is and is leaving all of the explaining up to everyone else. Coming in at number 3 now, we have the drifter. Now for some people, the biggest fear they have about space is that feeling of drifting away from the space station, unable to claw themselves back. Well, Scott Parazinski may have had the closest experience to that. He was performing a spacewalk when a jammed solar panel threatened the safety of the entire space station and the crew inside. After 72 hours, NASA came up with a plan. Scott was told to travel further away from the safety of an airlock than had ever been attempted. He later said in an interview, there was a real danger that we could do even worse damage to the space station. Then there was the potential of risk to myself because if there was any metal to metal connection with the solar panel or arcing, I could actually electrocute myself or cause ignition of the 100% oxygen in my spacesuit. The stakes were high, but Scott succeeded. Disaster was averted, but sadly many of Scott's heroics are still not known by the masses. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the secret transmission. In 1975, retired retired chief of NASA Communications Systems, Maurice Chatelain, published his book, Our Cosmic Ancestors. In it, he made an extraordinary claim about the first manned mission to the moon. He said, only moments before Armstrong stepped down the ladder to set foot on the moon, 2 UFOs hovered overhead. Edwin Aldrin took several pictures of them. Some of these photographs have been published in the June 1975 issue of Modern People magazine. Now, this claim was linked to the story that there were 2 minutes of radio silence after Armstrong set foot on the moon. People claim that the lost audio was of him saying, "These babies were huge, sir, enormous. Oh God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out here lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us." Now, of course, all of this is speculation. An actual recording of that audio or of those pictures has never surfaced. That either means it didn't happen at all, or it's been covered up very, very well. Either way, it's a creepy story. And finally, number 1 now, we have the Green Bolt. Gordon Cooper was a well-known astronaut who flew on the Mercury 9 and Gemini 5 missions. He was the last American to fly alone in space. In 1963, he flew aboard the Mercury capsule for a circumnavigational trip around the world. Everything seemed to be going okay, and then, on his final orbit, as he passed over Perth, Australia, he saw a green object swing towards him at an incredible speed. At first, he thought it was just a figment of his imagination. There have been times where pilots and astronauts have seen objects like this, but their equipment detected nothing. This time was different though. The Moochia tracking station in Western Australia actually picked the object up on their radar. That was huge. Now he had something solid to back up his own experience. He reported the incident to the National Broadcasting Company. When he returned to Earth, he was eager to tell his side of the story, but Gordon claims he was approached by NBC reporters who told him they had been instructed to not question him about the sighting. All of this has only fanned the flames of a UFO conspiracy. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Fireflies. In February 1962, John Glenn noticed something strange outside the window while aboard the Friendship 7 spacecraft. He noticed strange glowing particles floating in space nearby that looked like fireflies. He radioed down to mission control saying, "This is Friendship 7. I'll try to describe what I'm in here. I'm in a big mass of some very small particles that are brilliantly lit up like they're luminescent. I never saw anything like it. They're round a little, they're coming by the capsule and they look like little stars. A whole shower of them coming by. They swirl around the capsule and go in front of the window and they're all brilliantly lighted. They probably average maybe 7 or 8 feet apart, but I can see them all down below me also." John then went on to say that they were moving very slowly and almost seemed to be matching his current speed. After a thorough investigation, NASA scientists deduced that the lights were probably frost flakes that were being lit up as they fell away from the craft. They admitted that that does kind of make them look like fireflies. Of course, there are still people out there online that insist this may have been first contact with some sort of glowing space books. Next up at number 9 now, we have the Glass Dome. Richard Hoagland is an author who wrote a conspiracy theory book about the Apollo missions called Dark Mission. Now in it, he claims that ancient builders constructed enormous domes enclosing huge areas of the moon's surface. They would have had water and air inside them at one point. He claims there are actually hidden lunar cities that appear blurred and distorted because they're being viewed through this glass. Of course, the next question is, where is he getting all this from? Well, he points out that Apollo 12 astronaut Alan Bean said that on that mission, space seen from the lunar surface was black but shiny as if it was being viewed through glass. Of course, Hoagland used this as proof of his glass dome theory, saying space should be velvet black, it should be inky black, it should be infinity, unending, deep, endless black, it shouldn't be shiny. This is something that Alan Bean has denied and does not claim himself, but the story has gained traction among some conspiracy theory groups. Moving on to number 8 now, we have Musa Manarov. That's the name of this former cosmonaut who is known for spending 541 consecutive days in space. It's safe to say he was an experienced cosmonaut who received numerous awards and honours. In all those years, he never reported anything too out of the ordinary, except for one time in 1991. That year, Manarov was on a mission to the Mir space station and was filming a visiting space capsule dock nearby. He filmed its approach. As he filmed its approach, he saw an object that looked like it was coming off the spacecraft. Here's some of that footage so you can see for yourself.
And this by Musa Manarov is the best known one from Russia, I believe.
Okay, I think we can immediately, being out in space here, dismiss the possibility that this is
space is
a rock.
Now, whatever that was, it freaked him out and he became convinced he had seen something unusual. He said he knew there was nothing that could come loose at that point during the docking procedure. As he continued to watch the object, it floated downwards and away from the capsule. When this footage began to be shared around the world, some people claimed it was nothing more than space junk, but Manarov said he knows what he saw up there and it was definitely not space junk. Next up at number 7 now, guys, we have the dots. In March 2017, UFO hunters claimed they had found proof of aliens in NASA's own footage. The video in question shows astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti demonstrating how to operate window shutters on the ISS. Now, as she talks to the camera in the video, we see several white objects coming into view. The UFO community quickly jumped on this and referred to it as the smoking gun. There was no denying a big alien cover-up now. Of course, there's always two sides to the story though. Scott Brando is a man who forensically examines alleged UFO pictures and videos. He gave this video the same treatment and concluded that the lights were either lens reflections or ice particles. Not quite as exciting, but maybe that's the truth. Moving on to number 6 now, we have the organic being. In August 2018, former NASA astronaut Leland Melvin tweeted out that he saw something curved and organic looking floating outside of his craft while aboard the space shuttle Atlantis. Naturally, the first thing he did was tell NASA about it, but they said what he was seeing was not extraterrestrial, but just a piece of ice. Now, when he shared this story on Twitter, the Twitter account for UFO Sightings Daily asked him if he thought that NASA was lying about that. They believe that his opinion of something looking organic is much more reliable than the opinion of someone on the ground over 400 miles away. Melvin replied that he didn't think so, but you never know. Now, some people even thought that Melvin might have made the whole thing up just to, I don't know, entertain people. All of this has left many questions about his story. Ice or organic being? Only Melvin really knows. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the wolves. This is an incredible story, honestly. It's a terrifying account from Russian cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. Now, in 1965, he famously performed the first spacewalk ever. It was a success, but it was very nearly a disaster. During the walk, he experienced both air leaks in his suit and material unexpectedly stiffening. This meant he was almost unable to cram himself back inside the capsule. He actually had to lower his own suit pressure and risk getting the bends when he was inside. If that wasn't bad enough, his craft went off course during re-entry and landed in the Ural Mountains, where he and his commander were forced to wait for rescue as howling wolves began to encircle them. How crazy is that? Next time you guys think you've had a bad day, just spare a thought for Alexei Leonov. Alright, at the number 4 spot now, guys, we have the cryptic message. In 2016, NASA astronaut Scott Kelly gave an interview that conspiracy theorists say contained cryptic messages about seeing aliens in space. In the video, he talked about his 340 days on the International Space Station, and then people say he slipped up and mentioned a cover-up by NASA and the US government. Kelly was asked about his body's response to being in space for so long. He said, and I quote, "Adjusting to space is easier than adjusting to Earth for me. I don't think I ever felt completely normal up there. I think coming back to gravity is harder than leaving gravity, so maybe the aliens got it a lot easier than we do." It was that mentioning of the word alien that sent alarm bells ringing among the conspiracy theorists. He also spoke about a virtual reality game that the astronauts play on the space station, which simulated an alien attack on the space station. Once again, conspiracy theorists were asking, why would NASA make such a violent game, especially one with such a terrifying scenario? Once again, this is one of those stories where it's NASA's word against people who just don't seem to trust NASA. What do you guys think though? Moving on to number 3 now, we have the flashing lights. This is a very famous set of stories if you're familiar with the moon landings. During the Apollo missions that took astronauts to the moon for the first time, several astronauts reported seeing strange flashing lights. They claimed that these lights flashed in their eyeballs even when their eyes were closed. On one mission, astronaut Charles Duke wore a helmet, closed his eyes, and he still described the light flashes he was seeing to his team. He said they were clusters of white streaks. They happened at the exact same moment that his helmet recorded cosmic rays passing through his helmet and his head. Coincidence? Well, Apparently not. NASA confirmed that the astronauts were actually seeing cosmic rays, something we don't see here on Earth because they're all absorbed by our atmosphere. They're so powerful that you can even see them in space with your eyes closed. That's pretty mental. Moving on to the number 2 spot now, we have the floater. On the morning of August 19th, 2013, NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy noticed something floating outside of the International Space Station. Here's a little clip so you can see for yourself.
Chris Cassidy had noted an object that was floating past the station near the Station Progress 52 cargo ship.
Cassidy noticed this near the Progress cargo vehicle. He called down to Mission Control Houston and took some video of it. Now at first, NASA was just as confused as he was. Was this a UFO? It certainly fit the literal description of an unidentified flying object. After a lot of speculation, NASA said it was an antenna cover from Russia's Zvezda service module. However, many people remain totally unconvinced. They believe that the object is something extraterrestrial, not something of human origin, and that NASA has made up this cover story to avoid public alarm. Personally, as you might know by now, I believe NASA, but what do you guys think? And finally at number 1 now, we have the saucer. This story comes from Donald Slayton, an astronaut during the Mercury missions. He revealed in an interview that he saw UFOs in 1951. He said, "I was testing a P-51 fighter in Minneapolis when I spotted this object. I was at about 10,000 feet on a nice, bright, sunny afternoon. I thought the object was a kite, then I realized that no kite is going to fly that high. As I got closer, it looked like a weather balloon, grey and about 3 feet in diameter, but as soon as I got behind the darn thing, it didn't look like a balloon anymore. It looked like a saucer, a disc. About the same time, I realized that it was suddenly going away from me, and there I was, running at about 300 miles per hour. I tracked it for a little way, and then all of a sudden the damn thing just took off. It pulled about a 45-degree climbing turn and accelerated and just flat disappeared." An interesting story, and it's of particular interest to UFO enthusiasts because neither Slayton or NASA has provided a rational explanation for this very speedy saucer.
Number 10. Al Worden. American test pilot, engineer, and NASA astronaut Alfred Merrill Worden. He was the module pilot for the Apollo 15 lunar mission back in 1971. Now after Apollo 15 reached lunar orbit, Worden spent 3 days alone in said module. Just space things, just journaling out some space thoughts. Traveling the furthest out there from any other human ever. It's a lonely road, I'm betting. After Al returned, the crew and him became involved in a NASA controversy over postage stamps that they had taken to the moon. Yeah, it turns out you can't litter there as well. Can't litter here nor there. Littering's bad everywhere. That rhymed. Let's hit that thumbs up. I don't know. They were reprimanded by NASA and did not fly in space ever again because of postage stamps. Or was there something else involved? Warner remained at NASA until 1975 and then he entered the private sector. And then it gets a little weird. On a British television morning show, when Al Worden was asked about why we should return to the moon, he replied, "Survival of our species." That's always odd when an astronaut says that, huh? When asked about alien life existing out there, Al's response was to get books on the ancient Sumerians and see what they had to say about it. Do you feel like Al Worden saw some shit? I feel like Al Worden saw some shit. Number 9. Edgar Mitchell. U.S. Navy officer, aviator, test pilot, engineer, all that good stuff, and most importantly, NASA astronaut. He was a lunar module pilot of Apollo 14 back in 1971, and he spent 9 hours working on the lunar surface. He was the 6th person to walk on the moon. He was walking while Worden was up there drifting in the currents of space, so that's a dream team right there. Mitchell publicly expressed his opinions that he was sure that the thousands of UFOs that he saw belonged to other planets. Again, thousands of UFOs that he saw in space. So I can't breathe. That's very scary. Dateline NBC conducted an interview with Mitchell in 1996 where he talked about meeting officials from 3 different countries who all claimed to have met extraterrestrials in person at some point. It's a lot of officials and a lot of meetings with a lot of weird handshakes, I bet. In 2004, he told the St. Petersburg Times that the US government was studying alien bodies. In 2008, Mitchell was interviewed and he claims that the Roswell crash was indeed real and that aliens have contacted humans several times, but that government's hidden the truth now for 60 years. Yeah, he sadly passed away in 2016, so we can't ask him any more questions. But do we believe? Do we? I kinda do. I don't know. James Webb? He definitely believes. Number 8. Chris Hadfield. Retired Canadian astronaut, engineer, fighter pilot, and musician. Oh, okay. Okay. In 1992, Chris Hadfield was accepted into the Canadian astronaut program. He first flew in space in 1995, and since then, he's seen tons of stuff up there, just zipping around apparently. He says he can't explain it, but he also isn't running with it. He says, quote, "To see something in the sky that you don't understand, and then to immediately conclude that it's an intelligent life form from another solar system is the height of foolishness and lack of logic." End quote. Also, end roast. Oh my god. However, he thinks that there could potentially be alien life, and that is in the clouds of Venus, or on the distant moons of one of our gas giants. That's his best guess, so honestly, yeah. Fair, more than fair. Number 7, James McDivitt. James McDivitt is an American test pilot, Air Force pilot, engineer, and NASA astronaut who flew in both the Gemini and Apollo programs. That's a fat resume right there. It's good God, nice. After graduating first in his class with a Bachelor of Science degree in aeronautical engineering, in 1962, McDivitt was selected by NASA for the Gemini 4 mission. And in 1965, he saw, filmed, and photographed an object, which apparently approached the Gemini 4 as they were orbiting Earth. Now, this all happened right over Hawaii. Major James McDivitt describes this as a cylindrical object. It was white, with a long arm that stuck out on the side. The film was sent back to NASA and reviewed by some NASA film technicians, but once it was returned, it was not the same photo. This one was a photo of sun reflection on the window. Yeah, the old NASA swap. Gotcha. We got the secret one here, tucked away in that secret Vault app on our iPod Touch. That's where that photo is. Do we believe this? I don't know, I kinda do. In 1975, McDivitt said it was something he definitely couldn't identify. It looked like a beer can with a pencil sticking out of it, so party on, dude. 25 years of experience. What could you possibly seen? I don't know, now I'm questioning my existence. Number 6, Spaceman. Okay, we've all been photobombed before. It's a blessing in disguise, right? But when Jim Templeton took a photo of his daughter in an empty marsh long before Photoshop existed, it appears an astronaut photobombed this family moment. Now, Jim assures us that nobody was around, which I believe, or else what a weird photo to take in an empty field, right? It's weird in all parties. Also, the fact that this man looks like he's from space makes it a bit more believable, makes it a bit more jarring to look at. What are we seeing right now? This is so creepy. Kodak, like, you know, the photo company Kodak, they got involved in the story. They confirmed this photo wasn't tampered with. Yeah, let's run everything by Kodak from now on, I guess. They're so confident. They're like, no, it's fake. I'm like, how do you know? Oh my God. Mr. Kodak, stop. Number 5, Black Knight satellite. Not to be confused with Martin Lawrence's Black Knight, although that's pretty historical and memorable in itself, but a little different. The Black Knight satellite is something that's been orbiting our planet for thousands of years, apparently. And we still question its existence and, you know, where it came from. Alien astronaut from the future trying to warn Earth? That's a good theory I read. Sure, why not? Let's lean into there. I buy it. This photo you've probably seen at one point or another. It was taken back in 1998 during an American mission to the International Space Station. Now, during a spacewalk in 98, one of the thermal covers came loose and drifted away from the station. So could this be that cover? If so, what did it catch onto? And why does everybody want it to be an alien night so badly? These photos shared originally by NASA look a lot different than a solar sail. I'll happily admit, it looks like an alien. Number 4, the time traveler. Do you believe in time travel? If your answer is no, just go back to the beginning of this video and then, you know, there you go, you've done it. Fooled me somehow. If your answer is no, maybe this will change your mind. I don't know. It's a common theme in movies. You see it in Back to the Future, Looper, Avengers. Time travel plots are fun, but they're absolute obviously. But when we see a case like the Cape Scott story, we can't help but be intrigued a little, right? We want to believe just a bit. Could it be? Is it possible? This is an interesting photo. Let's talk about it. It comes from Ray Peterson's book, The Great Cape Scott Story. Now that book was from 1974, but the actual photo in it was taken over 100 years ago from our date right now. In this photo, we see this modern looking guy rocking shorts, messy morning surfer hair. He looks kind of cool. I don't know. The dude looks like Tony Stark. He looks casual as shit. He doesn't look like he's from that time period at all. Now, many believe he's an astronaut or a time traveler who got stuck in time and just went with it, which is half hilarious, but also half terrifying. That's not an early 1900s man. There's no chance. Don't they all have monocles and big mustaches and walk with a cane? I don't know. I'm watching a lot of Peaky Blinders right now. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Number 3, Gordon Cooper. Leroy Gordon Cooper, Jr. He's an American aerospace engineer, test pilot, US Air Force pilot, you name it. And he's the youngest of the 7 original astronauts in Project Mercury, aka the first human space program of the United States. Not too shabby. In Cooper's autobiography, Leap of Faith, he recounts his experiences with the Air Force and NASA and a UFO conspiracy. We love those. Cooper claimed to have seen his first UFO while flying over Germany. Cooper also claimed that up until his death that the US was covering up many UFO operations. He said there were hundreds of reports made by his fellow pilots as well, and many of them coming from military pilots on radar. In his memoirs, Cooper wrote that he had seen unexplained aircraft many times throughout his career, and in 1978 he actually testified before the United Nations on the topic. Put your hand on a book for aliens? That's crazy. That's what now? Number 2, Buzz Aldrin. Yes, the astronaut who punches back. We love Buzz Aldrin. American astronaut, engineer, fighter pilot with a doctorate of science in astronautics. You lose this street fight every day, my friend. Mr. Aldrin performed 3 spacewalks in 1966, and of course in 1969, he did the Apollo 11 mission, where he and Neil Armstrong were the first 2 people ever to land on the moon. Now, Buzz said that he saw something out there. He's confident. Close enough to be observed, so, you know. Quote, I observed a light out the window that appeared to be moving alongside us. What could that be other than a spacecraft from another country or another world? It was either the rocket that had separated from us or the 4 panels that moved away when we extracted the lander, right? End quote. He asks us, I'm like, I don't know, I wasn't up there, man. No idea. I've seen Gravity, I have no idea what you're talking about. After he returned from his missions, he was convinced that he saw aliens while he was out there. He took a lie detector test after talking about this incident and he passed, so that's jarring. Buzz thinks that there's a monolith on Phobos, which is one of the moons that orbits Mars. It actually orbits it every 7 hours. Buzz thinks there's a monolith just sitting there. He says when people find out about that, they're gonna say, who put that there? Okay, great question. Who put this giant monolith there on that moon? Was it aliens? Future humans? Was it Buzz Aldrin? Who knows? And finally, number 1, Michael Collins. NASA veteran and the very first driver up there, Mr. Michael Collins, served as command module pilot on the historic Apollo 11 mission back in 1969. Now, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon for the first time, Collins was parking. He was just hanging up. He was feeding the meter, for lack of a better term, while everyone else was, hopping around. Mr. Collins stayed up there by himself in lunar orbit, waiting for the safe return of his crewmates. Just by himself. That's terrifying. The astronaut retired from NASA in 1970 and he spent his time answering questions on Twitter, because that's pretty fun. That's what some astronauts do, I guess, now. And some of these questions were really interesting. Are we alone? Hashtag Ask Michael Collins. He wrote in his book saying things like, quote, I am alone now, truly alone and absolutely isolated from any known life. Although I may feel like I'm the same person, I also feel like I'm different from other people. I've been places and done things you simply would not believe. Collins circled the moon once every 2 hours, so what could he possibly have seen out there alone? Hey, what's scarier, walking on an unknown rock that apparently no one has ever visited, or flying all the way around it by yourself in the pitch black with no communications? I would say the latter, definitely the latter. I would not want to sit in a dark room. I can't even sit in my bedroom alone in the dark, let alone orbit a fucking moon. No way.
Alright, coming in at number 10, we have space snakes. Dr. Musgrave is a trustworthy man, or at least his credentials suggest he must be. Not only is he a NASA astronaut, he has 6 degrees, and he's a doctor and a mathematician. He has made 6 space flights, and he believes that there is life out there. In 1994, he said, on 2 of my missions, and I still don't have an answer, I have seen a snake out there. What? It's not just a wee little space snake either. He said that it was 6, 7 or 8 feet long. He said that the snake followed him around for a long period of time and he tried to communicate with it. Space snakes, honestly. Dr. Musgrave thinks that they must have their own propulsion technique, which honestly is just baffling and is a can of worms or snakes. Coming in at number 9, we have asteroids. Astronaut Chris Hadfield conducted a Reddit AMA and he discussed something that scared him. He said, sometimes we hear pings as tiny rocks hit our spaceship, and also the creaks and snaps of expanding metal as we go in and out of sunlight. The solar panels are filled with tiny holes from micrometeorites. Honestly, that really terrifies me as a person who's like a bit scared of flying in an aeroplane. This would deeply stress me out. He also said, I watched a large meteorite burn up between me and Australia, and to think of that hypersonic dumb lump of rock randomly hurtling into us instead sent a shiver up my back. Like, I'll say Chris, mate, Jesus. Coming into number 8, we have The Formation. Gordon Cooper, the last American to spend time in space alone, has had a couple of very strange experiences in the skies. The first happened when he was a member of the Air Force. He was flying with other pilots in 1951 when he saw, I quote, a vast armada of UFOs flying in formation at extremely high altitudes. I'm sorry, but vast armada, that is terrifying, not just one curious UFO, a whole fleet. On top of that, in 1963, Cooper was shot into space aboard a Mercury capsule to circumnavigate the world. As he was passing Perth, he noticed a fast-flying green object that was also picked up by Australian tracking systems. Now, the press were briefed that they were not allowed to talk to him about this. Why? Like, seriously, why? Coming into number 7, we have the check mark. American astronaut Leroy Chiao was the commander of the International Space Station in 2005. During his time up there, he saw some extremely weird things. He explained his encounter to the Huffington Post by saying, "I saw some lights that seemed to be in a line and it was almost like an upside down check mark, and I saw them fly by and I thought it was awfully strange." Could this have been the formation that Cooper was talking about? Some skeptics even tried to pass the lights off as far off fishing boat lights from Earth, but to be honest, I'm skeptical of those skeptics. Coming in at number 6, we have magnificent desolation. What is it like on the moon? Utterly terrifying according to Buzz Aldrin. Buzz, as we know, was the second man on the moon. Yes, televised recordings of the moon can be seen, and yes, we have high-res photographs, but truly knowing what it feels like to be up there is something only a handful of people can talk to us about. In a Reddit AMA, Buzz Aldrin describes his experience. He said, "My first words of my impression of being on the surface of the moon that just came to my mind are magnificent desolation." He continued by saying, "There is no place on Earth as desolate as what I was viewing in those first few moments on the lunar surface. Beyond me, I could see the moon curving away, no atmosphere, black sky, cold, colder than anyone could experience on Earth when the sun is up." While that sounds totally incredible, it also sounds like the beginnings of a total existential breakdown. Coming into number 5, we have the spheres. In 1981, following the Saljut mission, the USSR cosmonaut Major General Vladimir Kolyvanok gave a press conference in which he shared some very interesting information. He said that he looked out of a porthole and saw something he simply couldn't explain, something impossible to the laws of physics. He described the object he saw as spherical and elliptical, saying that it exploded into a beautiful golden light. After that, he saw 2 more spheres and a white smoke sphere cloud. Then, as they flew through the Terminator, the name for the zone between light and day, he lost sight of them. Honestly, how fascinating and terrifying at the very same time. To me, it's also weird and interesting how Russia appears to be more forthcoming in discussing things that they've seen in space, whereas the United States are keen to keep a lid on it. Why do you think the United States are so heavily guarded on what they'll say about what they've seen in space? Honestly, I don't know. Coming into number 4, we have the knocking. In 2003, Yang Liwei was the first Chinese astronaut to be propelled into space. Now, I understand the loneliness of space might send you a little bit mad, but he said one night that he heard a strange and continuous knocking. He said, and I quote, "Someone was knocking on the body of the spaceship just as knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. It neither came from outside nor inside the spaceship." I'm sorry, but honestly, what? Isn't that some of the creepiest space descriptions that you've ever heard? It seems he wasn't the last to hear it either. 2 further astronauts heard the same space knocks when they went up there. What are these? Coming into number 3, we have the music. Listening to the transcript of the words said on board Apollo 10 is bone-chilling. The spaceship passed by the dark side of the moon, and as it did, the astronauts heard a very weird ethereal music. This is what was said between Eugene Cernan, Thomas Stafford and John Young. "That music sounds out of spacey, doesn't it? Do you hear that whistling sound?" "Yes." "Boy, that sure is weird music. We're gonna have to find out about that. Nobody will believe us." Later, Cernan said, "That eerie music is what's bothering me. You know what? I hear it too. Who is going to believe it? Nobody. Should we tell them about it?" I don't know, I think we ought to think about it some. It seems that the Apollo 11 crew heard it too. What was it? We don't really know. Coming into number 2, we have heat is rising in the capsule. So this is really sad and really disturbing, so do skip forward if you aren't ready for something truly terrifying. In 1967, Russian cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov did not make it back to Earth alive, something he suspected would happen when he agreed to be the solo pilot of the Soyuz 1. His spacecraft malfunctioned and he was quite aware he was going to die. Some of the last things he said can't be translated into words. He was screaming and crying words of anger. Among the last words that can be deciphered are, "The heat is rising in the capsule" and "You've killed me." Honestly, that makes me so sad. Finally, coming into number 1, we have "They're watching us." Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, had something very scary to say when he arrived at the moon in the Apollo 11 mission. It was something he spoke about once but never spoke about again. In a secret transmission to NASA, according to the retired chief of communications system Maurice Chatelain, the first man on the moon's first words were actually, "Oh God, you won't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out here lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us." Now this wasn't heard by the world as the broadcast was dropped for 2 minutes. Armstrong never spoke about it again, although a lot of credible sources have confirmed that this is what he said.